Greetings, Nova Forum participants. I'm Bryan Keene. I teach art history at Riverside City College and was previously a curator of illuminated manuscripts at the Getty Museum for the last decade. I regret that I'm not there with you today, as I enjoyed the conversations that we began last fall, and I look forward to our future gatherings. I wanted to start by thanking Professor Albertson for getting me a copy of Utopia, and I've especially enjoyed reading through this critical edition. But I also wanted to thank Dr. Cynthia Colburn for inviting me to join her in offering some remarks today. Cindy, you're one of my longest standing mentors and a close friend. And indeed, the way that I think about art history and that I live my life, the values that I've developed with my family, are very much modeled on those that you demonstrate in your day to day life. So I'm thankful for you and offer gratitude today. I'd like to share my screen and I'll get into these remarks. I've titled this discussion In Search of New Worlds. Before getting into the meat of these remarks, I wanted to begin by acknowledging that the land, the water, the air, and the natural resources around my home and workplace here in Southern California are the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Tongva, the Cahuilla, the Payom Cahuicham, and numerous other indigenous peoples whose presence here stretches back in time immemorial and remains vibrant and a critical part of our society today. The visual heritage of these indigenous communities can be seen all around us through rock art, petroglyphs carved into the hillsides around our homes, and to painted works like this one on screen by the Tongva artist from here in Greater Los Angeles County called Weshoyo Alvitre. One of the things I've enjoyed in learning about the indigenous history of this place is the stories that are told and continue to be passed down in oral tradition about Turtle Island, which is represented in Weshoyo's painting. According to a number of traditions that can be traced back to the Haudenosaunee or the Iroquois Nation of the northeastern United States and across this great country, tells of a mythical tortoise on whose back grew up the landmass that some call North America today. So that's a really powerful and potent image for us to think about as we think on other islands in our discussion of utopia. And I want to challenge and encourage us to continue to be good stewards of these lands and to connect with Indigenous peoples around us, whether it's the Tongva and the Chumash there in Malibu, or the Tongva proper in central Los Angeles, where USC is located, or anywhere in the surrounding area that you can get to know through nativeland.ca, the website that's listed on screen, or downloading the app of the same name. The background to my title slide showed two islands. The first is Thomas More's island Utopia in the 1518 printed edition with woodcuts by Ambrosius Holbein, the brother to Hans Holbein the Younger, whose portrait of Thomas More I'll show in just a moment. In that woodcut, which accompanied the second of the editions, the first being printed in 1516, we see the island Utopia with ships sailing around, and on the facing page, the Utopian alphabet. The image at right then is from a very different world island. This island is Tenochtitlan, which is an Aztec precinct, today known as Mexico City. This map folded out of a numerous page printed edition of Hernán Cortés' Cartas de Relación de las Américas. This is a text that Hernán Cortés began drafting in 1519 when he arrives in present day Mexico. And he encounters and would then quickly decimate the population of the Mexica, the Aztec peoples. Here in the 1524 edition, printed in Nuremberg, an important printing center in the 16th century, we see Tenochtitlan in the center of this map. with the two great temples that were once there. As Hernan Cortes describes, these are temples of sacrifice, and the roadways that connect outward to other precincts of the Mexica territory describe islands of pleasure, islands of sacrifice, islands of prayer, and so forth. And you'll see ships sailing around this island, very much reminiscent perhaps of Thomas More's Utopia. I'd like you to keep these two islands in mind today as I structure these remarks. I first came to know of Thomas More's Utopia in high school through quick readings of excerpts of the Utopia, but didn't really pay much uh, thought to this work. And it was really the senior year at Pepperdine University when I took a course called Religion and Culture, thinking about Christianity in a broader global context, in which we read Erasmus' In Praise of Folly, another contemporaneous text. We also read travel narratives in the Age of Discovery, discovery texts by Cristobal Colon, Christopher Columbus, and nuanced that idea of discovery and talked about the problematics of that idea of discovery, using words like encounter instead, and what that encounter really looked like, not only from the perspective of the Europeans who were traveling across the Atlantic, but also from the indigenous perspective. But I also recall reading this book by Craig Gay called The Way of the Modern World, or Why It's Tempting to Live as If God Doesn't Exist. This is a book that I keep with me on my nightstand and refer to quite frequently. What Craig Gay describes is what he calls practical atheism, which develops, he argues, beginning with the dissemination of text through the printing press and through the move from the medieval period to the Renaissance and the gradual emergence into the Enlightenment, where writers, thinkers, and philosophers begin to live their lives as if God didn't exist, acknowledging the existence of God and the way in which God manifests in our lives and directs the course of our lives, but that our beliefs and affiliations with politics or with the economy and eventually with technology create a worldview in which we don't stop enough to think about God's role in our lives. And he talks about the way in which we no longer dedicate as much time to prayer, hours of prayer, as individuals like Thomas More would have been familiar with, or regulating our day based on the liturgical calendar, praying at length every 3 hours, and attending services multiple times throughout the day. That with things like our smartphones, for example, it's so easy for us to quickly Google information and to find answers. So, those are a few thoughts that I had in approaching Utopia today, recalling my first encounter with the text and the way that I too think about the idea of a perfect place, a good place, and our role as citizens in creating that perfect place. In the year 2016, to mark the 500th anniversary of the publication of Utopia, the Museum Leuven hosted this exhibition, and the Getty was one of the lenders. There were numerous installations throughout the town celebrating the legacy of Thomas More's Utopia, but situating the Utopia in a broader context, looking at that late medieval or Renaissance world in which the text was being printed and produced and circulating, but also thinking about the context of the eventual Reformation, the response by both the Protestants and the Catholics to a reforming spirit in the 16th century. Here in these installation shots, you see the importance of manuscripts, that is, handwritten and painted books, as well as printed books, maps of both the Earth itself and of the cosmos, portraits of famous individuals, humanists, mathematicians, astronomers, and more, luxury arts like tapestries, sculptures, altarpieces, and more. This manuscript from the 1470s is one that we lent from the Getty. It's the visions of an Irish knight Tondal, a very early medieval text that was copied by hand in the late 15th century, about 1475. And it's made for the Duchess Margaret of York, who's wife of Charles the Bold, the Duke of the Burgundian Netherlands, part of present day Belgium. And here, Knight Tondal, like Dante centuries later, ventures through the realm of hell before emerging into paradise beyond. So I'd like to divide these remarks in two parts. The first of which I'll call From Parchment to Print, just to help situate us to think about the book as an object and the role that the book, whether written by hand or printed with a press, had in Europe and in the globalizing world in which Europe was a very small part in the 16th century when Thomas More's Utopia was being printed. And that portrait that we see is by Hans Holbein the Younger and hangs at the Frick Art Collection in New York. The second part I'll call Onward to Paradise, where we'll shift our perspective across the Atlantic and look at that tension of trade, travel, and the enslavement of peoples across the Atlantic and the impact that that story, that history, has for the context of Thomas More's Utopia. So, part one, From Parchment to Print. We often talk of the Gutenberg Revelation in the 15th century, when in 1455 Johannes Gutenberg developed a printing process using movable text, movable letters, by which large text like the Bible could be printed with greater ease than having to write every word, phrase, paragraph, and so forth by hand. These works circulated in greater quantity precisely because they were made on paper, which had been relatively rare up until this point in Europe. But printing with blocks made carved in wood and with letters or phrases that could move existed far into the past. Developments in China as early as the 7th and 8th century, moving across the Islamic world in the 8th, 9th, and 10th century. And so by the time in the 15th century that Europeans finally decide to use paper in greater frequency and use this form of printing it had already a global audience. I show you here just one copy of many of the Gutenberg Bibles, this one that lives at the Huntington Library in San Marino. The format of Gutenberg's Bible followed that of illuminated manuscripts, centuries old traditions, with two columns of block printed text here, red markings for the rubric or the opening lines telling us what passage we're in, and you'll see hand painted decoration even in the printed Gutenberg editions to emulate, in a way, the illuminated manuscripts. One of the important illuminated texts, or printed texts rather, from the late 15th century is the Nuremberg Chronicle, as it's called, which is made by Hartmann Schedel. Here at right, I show you his map of the world, showing just Africa, Europe, and Asia, though by 1493, when this was printed, Columbus had sailed to the Americas, but his accounts would begin to circulate more frequently starting from the 1493 moment onward. Hartmann Schedel's worldview shows the sons of Noah, Japheth, Shem, and Ham, flanking this map of the world. You see them here in these pendants. The winds that you see mark the movement of nautical and astronomical phenomenon. And then at the far end, like a bookmark, are the so called legendary or monstrous peoples, individuals who were thought to inhabit the far corners of the world. Well, that idea stretches all the way back to the earlier Middle Ages. And I show just a famous example, the so called Psalter map. It's a map of the world, Europe, Africa, and Asia, made in London about 1260, in which Asia is shown at the top, Europe is shown off to the lower left, and then Africa at right, with, you can see in alternating blue and red spaces, these so called legendary peoples, individuals with a single foot, or with a head on their shoulders, or with hair that covers their body, or dog shaped faces. Those ideas and beliefs would govern the thinking of Europeans who sailed across the Atlantic to the Taino lands, indigenous peoples of the greater Caribbean. Another important text from the late 15th century is Bernard Breidenbach's Sanctae Peregrinationes. This is a text about holy pilgrimage to Jerusalem, where the author describes all the peoples of the world that traveled to Jerusalem. The prints that accompany this volume by Erhard Roivich, you see at left Muslims and at right Ethiopians or Abyssinians or Indians, as he refers to them, showing the shifting nature of European ideas about geography at the time. What was remarkable about this text is that Breidenbach, with the Prince by Bayreuth, included transliterations and transcriptions of languages other than Latin. There are instances of Hebrew, Aramaic, Arabic, which you see at left, and also the Ge'ez or the Gez liturgical language of Ethiopia, also shown in this manuscript. So I hope these two instances give you some context for Moore's map of the island of Utopia and the Utopian alphabet that you see in the manuscript. Printed books from Europe also had an impact on other global markets. For example, this printed book of hours that then informed ivory carvers in Sierra Leone, in West Africa, in the late 15th and then early 16th centuries. And you see an ivory that was carved for export to the Portuguese market, the Portuguese having an extended presence here, not only for centuries worth of trade in salt, sugar, rubber, and so forth, and the Portuguese that brought tin and copper so that the West Africans could create bronze. But they also created or commissioned these ivory works to contain salt to take back with them to Europe. And then just a few years before the printing of Thomas More's Utopia, we see this instance, a psalter printed in Ge'ez or Gez, here in the Vatican Library, which was on my backdrop before I shared my screen that you may have seen, showing a psalter, the complete book of Psalms in the Ethiopian language. Ethiopians had a long presence in Rome, both as ambassadors and as pilgrims to the Holy City. I also, in thinking about Dr. Colburn's remarks about the resurrection, was reminded of this fresco painting. It's one of my favorites, and it's also from the Vatican. It's by the artist Pinturicchio, and it shows the resurrected Christ with the Pope, Alexander VI, of the Spanish Borgia family, kneeling before the resurrected Christ. The soldiers are either asleep or beginning to wake up and look upward at Christ. Well, several years ago, when I was studying in Rome, a news story broke about the cleaning of these frescoes in the private apartments of the Borgia Pope, where conservators noticed these nude individuals with feathered headdresses in the background. They argued that these may represent some of the earliest images of Amerindians. Their description as nude and with feathered headdresses, with spears and arrows in hand, matches descriptions by Columbus and others that came back to Spain after having been to the Caribbean. That story, and here's some details, would then impact some scenes in the Showtime series The Borgias, where you see in one of the episodes a chained Amerindian brought before the Pope in Rome. We know of a number of individuals brought back with Columbus. At least 8, it seems, may have survived, with about 20 or so initially forcibly brought across the Atlantic. So that's another context that I think about quite frequently as an educator, but also as a curator, how to tell this story about the so-called Renaissance or this age of discovery, moving into this later period that I'll end with at the beginning of the Enlightenment. One of the stories that I've been thinking quite a bit about is the story of the three kings. The three kings in the New Testament who are described as bringing gifts to the Christ child. Indeed, they're not described as three, but they bring 3 gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And gradually in the 15th century, one of the kings is shown as black, as shown as an African, though a century of European chroniclers had described one of the kings as being from Africa. But as a number of scholars have argued, and as my colleague Kristen Collins and I presented at the Getty in 2019, it's with the rise of the enslavement of Black Africans that we see one of the figures, traditionally called Balthazar, being depicted as Black in European manuscripts. Well, by the early 16th century, in some contexts in Spain and Portugal, one of those kings, Balthazar, is also sometimes shown as being an Amerindian. In this example at right by Vasco de Fernandes from Portugal, we see the youngest of the kings, Balthazar, wearing a feather headdress and holding a spear, reminiscent of the Tupi or the Tupinamba peoples of Brazil. We see references to the Tupi peoples in works by Albrecht Dürer in 1514 or 1515, and by Hans Berkmeyer the Elder in the 1520s to early 30s. I present these images so that you constantly have in your mind that European audiences are contending with this landmass across the Atlantic that didn't fit with centuries worth of an understanding about the world, a world with three land masses. So this context, I think, is important as we venture into More's Utopia. And indeed, we read excerpts and critical assessments of the Americas in relation to More in the anthology that we've been looking at. So now part two, Onward to Paradise. The image that we see there is a portrait of the Aztec leader Moctezuma, whose life and story I'll get to in just a moment. As a curator at the Getty, I organized a series of exhibitions that centered on a global Middle Ages or a global early modern world. The desire that I had was to situate our collections of primarily Western European or Mediterranean objects in a global context. In 2016, the first exhibition opened called Traversing the Globe Through Illuminated Manuscripts. It was at the same time that my colleagues were taking our manuscript of Tondal's Visions to Leuven to celebrate the publication of the Utopia. So I didn't focus on Utopia so much in that exhibition, but in 2018, with the exhibition Pathways to Paradise, I did look at the theme of paradise and utopia more specifically, because India, for many Europeans, was the imaginary land on the horizon to the east, where the Garden of Eden was thought to be located. So I'll tell a few stories about how we might think of Thomas More's Utopia in this broader global context. One of the books that I love getting to know more about is Heinrich Bunting's Travel Through Holy Scripture. He's a Protestant writer, mathematician, cartographer, astronomer, you name it. He's a polymath, an individual of all trades. And in his volume, he begins with maps of the world, a map of Europe shown represented as a queen. He shows a map of Africa with the traditional contour of the continent that we would recognize today. Asia is the mythical winged horse Pegasus. But then he ends with this allegorical representation of Africa, Europe, and Asia as a clover leaf centered on Jerusalem, the holy city at the center of these worlds. You'll see his map lists a number of important cities across these land masses. Roma, the important city in Europe. Africa, you read about Morin land, or the land of black peoples, Ethiopia and Libya. And then in Asia, Arabia, India, Persia, Armenia, Mesopotamia, Syria, Chaldea. But off into the corner, we see the island, Die Neue Welt, the New World, America. And Das große Mittelmeer, the Great Middle Sea that connects across between Europe, Africa, and America. Another object that I became fascinated by, which is at the Huntington Library, is this world map from 1516, the very year in which Thomas More writes Utopia. It might be difficult to see what it is that we're looking at. Well, it's a sheet of cow's skin or cow hide. The head would have been here, the forelegs here, and the back legs there. It's rather grim, but this is how manuscripts were made throughout the medieval period. What we see here, where my mouse is sort of tracing, is the contour of Africa, with the Red Sea demarcated by these red lines. Curving around and ending the map is India. The map has nail holes all along the far edge, suggesting that another sheet of parchment would have completed this view of the world to China, Japan, and beyond. So what we have here is the Iberian Peninsula, Italy itself, and curving upward to Scandinavia. But moving across the Atlantic, we see this roundel, this round shape, that shows the Virgin Mary and three ships sailing across the Atlantic to the island of Cuba, Hispaniola, and the contour of Brazil, Portuguese territory, as we're told. This map was included in my exhibition Pathways to Paradise, looking at the way in which Europeans and those faith traditions in India thought about their world from the long Middle Ages up to this moment around 1500 when communities are coming together in greater number. I show a detail of the island of Cuba, where these gem islands are depicted in the roundel. Because one of the ideas that was associated with India is that in the land of India were great gems, and that was one of the goods that people were searching for in the Caribbean. Here you see a detail of that roundel of the Virgin and Child moving across the Atlantic, which I've turned so you see it upright, but the ships are now sailing in a sort of slanted direction. And then here is a detail of Ethiopia with these rivers flowing down from the Nile to the rivers of Paradise to the Garden of Eden, sometimes located in Ethiopia. And this image of a so called Prester John, a priest king who was still thought to inhabit the lands of Ethiopia or India, and whom some explorers or conquistadors sought for in the Caribbean. Here's another manuscript that was in the exhibition showing the Garden of Eden and the land of India and the island of Indonesia, the islands of Indonesia, where explorers and missionaries and others went looking for gems, which we see flowing out of the rivers of paradise. One of the goods that Europeans sought then in the Caribbean were pearls. And so one of the other stories then that I told was about this pearl brooch, which was likely made for the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V in the 16th century, made with a pearl from the Caribbean, since pearls at that point in the 16th century could no longer be sourced from the Indian Ocean because the Ottomans controlled those trade routes. On that pearl brooch, we see the mythical figure Hercules, who holds one of the pillars that is thought to have mythically been placed at the Strait of Gibraltar between the Iberian Peninsula and Northwest Africa. Well, why then do I show this ceramic vessel from Guatemala from the 7th through the 10th century? Well, ceramic vessels and manuscripts by the Maya peoples of the Yucatan to Guatemala and elsewhere recorded Maya history for centuries. And indeed, the Maya were one of the most literate people in the Americas. And by literate, I mean having a tradition of writing. There are only 4 Maya codices, though, that survive today, one in Dresden, one in Paris, one in Madrid, named after those colonial cities in which they're housed. And the third, sometimes called the Grolier manuscript, the oldest of which from the 12th century, is now in Mexico City, sometimes referred to as the Maya Codex of Mexico City. There are so few Maya codices because in the 16th century, in the 1560s, Diego de Landa, a friar, was sent on behalf of the emperor to burn the codices of the Maya. And it's for that reason that precious few survive. Their speech, their belief system, their writing system were seen as anathema to the Christian worldview. And so that theory of that history rather of conversion is important, I think, to have in the back of our minds as we think about the later legacy of Utopia. Here's the first printed book by an indigenous American writer. His name is Diego de Valadez. He's born to a conquistador father, an indigenous Nahua speaking mother in Mexico. And he returns to Europe to print this book in Perugia in Italy in 1579. His text, Retorica Christiana, tells of Christian teaching and the way in which Christian teachings were made relevant and accessible to the indigenous peoples of the Americas. At left, you see the so called Great Chain of Being, with the Trinity above, linked with the angelic host. Here, through a literal chain, a catena, down through Adam and Eve in paradise, surrounded by the saints and martyrs and peoples of the earth, to the birds, the fish, the creatures of the land, the trees and the plants, and so forth, with hell at the very bottom as we see a space of torture. And at the page at right, we see a crucifixion. The idea that Christ's blood that flows from his side and from his wounds, collected by 3 angels, would be given as the Eucharist to the indigenous Americans that we see down below, being presented with the gospel message there. You turn the pages of this manuscript and you see the ways in which the friars draw upon indigenous beliefs and make associations to Christian concepts like the afterlife of hell and of the beliefs of transubstantiation, the way in which the body and blood of Christ becomes the living presence of the divinity. Another text that was important and that circulated is that of Cesare Vecellio's costume books. He's the brother, relative to the famous Titian Vecellio, a painter from Venice. And here you see a few of his costumes of those Amerindians from Florida to Virginia, Mexico, South America, and more. These costume studies would then inform European ideas about the Americas. Peoples dressing with feathers, going about mostly unclothed, and having a hierarchical system with polytheistic beliefs. We see here another atlas from the Huntington, the so-called Vaillard Atlas made in Dieppe, France, 1547, showing Brazil, and you'd have to flip the map upside down to be able to see the actual contour of Brazil, the rivers, etc., moving downward. But I've turned it so that you can see the encounter between Europeans. The Brazilians who give parrots, monkeys, and other luxury objects to the Europeans who bring weaponry. And then the last of the printed books that I'll talk about just briefly is this work by Theodore de Brie from the 1590s, 100 years after Columbus's voyages, where here Adam and Eve, the Garden of Eden, are shown in America, opposite a text about Brazil, Brasiliam Americae Provinciam, Brazil, the American province. And he begins, as you turn the page, with passages from Genesis, associating paradise, this untouched, perfect place, with the Americas. In the exhibition Traversing the Globe, I ended with a reflection about this atlas that was by Ambrosius Arsenius with prints from Abraham Ortelius that showed the first complete view of the world, showing the full contour of North and South America, Asia, Africa, and Europe. And that map was one of many that informed the silver goblet created by Abraham Gessner in 1605, with a figure of Atlas holding up this map below. But one of the stories to constantly keep in mind is that the silver that was used to create this map likely came from South America, specifically from Inca territory of Peru. It's those material histories and legacies that I think often about, that underpin so much of the economy and the market of Europe in the 16th and then onward to the 17th and 18th centuries. Here's another view showing the way in which this goblet could be taken apart for serving wine or other luxury drinks. And so, as an epilogue, utopia or dystopia in the museum. In the 16th century, Duke Cosimo I de' Medici created an extravagant space in Palazzo Vecchio, the old palace in the center of Florence. It's the government building where Dante Alighieri, centuries earlier, resided over as a member of government. This so-called Sala del Mappamondo, the Room of Maps, was designed first by Ignazio Danti and later by Stefano Bondelmonti. The idea is to fill the room with two globes, one of the Earth, which we see here in the middle of the room, and the other of the cosmos, a complete map of the heavens. Both were going to descend from the ceiling of this space. The cabinets around this room were faced with maps, maps of all parts of the world. And the idea is that you would open the cabinet to reveal either secret passageways to other parts of the palace, which you can still access today on private tours of the institution, made famous by Dan Brown's text Inferno, but also to reveal the Duke's collection of objects from around the world. Here's artist schematics of what the room would have looked like if it had been completed to plan, with paintings on the ceiling of the cosmos, the two spheres descending, busts of famous Roman personalities, portraits painted at the top of famous men and women from history, past and present, and then maps of the world, as well as a clock allowing for the documentation of time. Here are several goods that were part of the Grand Ducal collections from the time of Cosimo onward through his son Francesco and Ferdinando into the early 17th century. We see feather skirts from Brazil, a jade mask from Mexico, an ivory tusk from West Africa, rock crystal from Switzerland, an incense burner from the Islamic world, either from Turkey or perhaps from Spain. A portrait of an Ethiopian emperor, Abnadengel, a portrait of Moctezuma, which still is housed in the Palazzo Pitti, one of the other later Medici residencies across the River Arno. Textiles from Ottoman Turkey, blue and white porcelain from Ming China, paintings of animals and plants as well from across the known world. What we see here in the portrait of Moctezuma, which is from the 17th century, recording the life and story of a much earlier figure, a figure from the 16th century. At far right is the Codex Mendoza, named after one of the vice-regal rulers of Mexico, that includes indigenous accounts of Moctezuma's rule and his eventual demise. But that image of Moctezuma from the handwritten text and then later printed sources from Spain to Italy and elsewhere still dominated popular imagination about the Americas even a century after Cortes' travels and destruction there. But I think about Moctezuma and Cosimo in the context of the formation of museums, museums as spaces of collections. Here, a print by Ferrante Imperato from 1599 showing a cabinet of curiosities, a collector's space, which come out of that tradition of creating private rooms in palaces, government spaces that were reserved for elite individuals, like the map room that Cosimo had designed in Florence. At right, you see the Walters Art Museum in Baltimore that drew inspiration from this print in designing their Great Hall, their early modern or their Renaissance gallery. And so I think one of the themes that came through to me in rereading Utopia is that of ethics, how to be an ethical citizen in this world of utopia. How can we today take that message of living a good life and being citizens concerned about those around us, the land and the spaces that we inhabit, like the land acknowledgement I gave at the beginning? I show here two views, one of the Louvre's in Paris Gallery of World Art, which is in the basement that you can access by a single elevator or winding staircase at one of the far ends of the institution. After you've walked the long Italian corridor to see the Mona Lisa and Italian Renaissance paintings, to descend into this relatively small space. And then across town, across the Seine, is the Musée du Quai Branly, the Musée de Jacques Chirac, which houses the Parisian collections of world art from Africa, Asia, greater Austronesia in the Pacific, and the Americas. You'll no doubt hear stories about museum ethics today. Where should these objects be housed? What are the ethics about how the objects came to be owned by these institutions? Were they, as is often the case, the product of colonial exploits, imperial plunder? Where should they be housed? What is the responsibility of institutions today to preserve them and to restitute them to their countries or places of origin? These are complicated issues, and I don't presume to have all the answers today. But I think in search of new world, new ways that we might live as citizens in this good place is one of the themes that came through most strongly to me in reading Utopia. I'll stop sharing now. It's been a pleasure offering these remarks. I'll happily take questions via email that Professor Albertson or Dr. Colburn can send to me after effect, or you're always welcome to reach out, and I look forward to joining in person in our next gathering. Thank you, be safe, and be well.